"Sir, step away from that vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." The command cut through the late morning noise outside the Great Plains Emergency Aviation Conference in Omaha, Nebraska, turning heads before Colonel Sergio Thorpe had even closed the sedan door. At 46, Sergio had spent more than 2 decades in the United States Air Force, and very little about his appearance suggested uncertainty. He was a gym-fit black man with close-cropped hair, a charcoal blazer over an open-collar blue shirt, and the measured posture of someone accustomed to making decisions when circumstances changed quickly. Yet on that clear October morning, most of the people gathering near the convention center in trance did not know his rank. They saw only Sergio standing beside a dark government fleet sedan while Officer Vincent Zimmerman approached from the traffic control lane. Zimmerman was 39, white, broad-shouldered, and muscular, with a crew cut and the confident stride of a veteran patrol officer who had already decided the situation required his attention. He had been assigned to manage traffic around the conference after security reported someone attempting to open a vehicle in a restricted section of the parking area. The report itself was legitimate, but the description was vague, and Zimmerman had arrived without knowing whether the person had simply approached the wrong car or had any connection to the event. Sergio had stepped outside between conference sessions because he needed an emergency planning binder from the sedan assigned to his interagency working group. He had unlocked the rear door and reached toward the document case when Zimmerman called to him. Sergio immediately stopped. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked. Zimmerman remained several feet away. "Is this your vehicle?" "It's assigned to our working group for the conference," Sergio answered. "The vehicle paperwork is inside, and my conference credential is in my jacket." It should have been an easy claim to verify. Instead, Zimmerman told him not to reach for anything. Sergio lowered his hands to his sides and waited. Around them, attendees wearing conference badges moved. Between the entrance and the parking lot, a shuttle stopped near the curb. 2 men carrying presentation folders slowed when they noticed the exchange. Sergio could feel attention shifting toward him, but his voice remained level. "You can verify my identification without any difficulty." Zimmerman studied him, then glanced through the open rear door at the binder and document case. "Who exactly are you here with?" "The United States Air Force." Zimmerman's expression barely changed. "In what capacity?" Sergio paused, not because the answer was complicated, but because he recognized what was happening. Each answer seemed to create another question instead of narrowing the issue. "I'm Colonel Sergio Thorpe. I'm here for the emergency logistics panel." A conference volunteer nearby looked towards Sergio as if recognizing the name from the program. Zimmerman did not acknowledge her. "Do you have identification proving that?" "Yes. In my inside jacket pocket." Sergio waited for instructions rather than reaching for it. Zimmerman looked toward the convention center, where nearly 40 attendees had begun filing outside during the break. Several were now watching. Sergio understood that Zimmerman had a report to investigate, and he had no objection to reasonable verification. What concerned him was how quickly a simple vehicle check was becoming something else. "Officer," Sergio said quietly, "tell me how you'd like me to provide the credential." Zimmerman considered him for another moment, then gave an instruction loud enough for the closest attendees to hear. "Turn toward the car and place both hands on the roof while I sort this out." Sergio looked at him, then at the sedan. He complied slowly, keeping every movement visible. Behind Zimmerman, a woman stopped halfway down the convention center steps. She recognized Sergio immediately. More phones began appearing in people's hands. Sergio placed his palms on the cool metal roof and said nothing, because at that moment he believed the fastest way to end the misunderstanding was to let the facts catch up with the assumption. What he could not know was that somewhere inside the police department, 2 older complaints were already waiting for exactly the kind of evidence this encounter was about to create. Sergio kept both hands resting on the sedan roof, while Officer Vincent Zimmerman stood several feet behind him, speaking into his radio. The position was embarrassing, but Sergio refused to let embarrassment dictate his response. Years of military leadership had taught him that pressure revealed judgment more clearly than speeches ever could. "Am I being detained?" Sergio asked. Zimmerman lowered the radio. "For the moment, yes." "On what basis?" "Security reported someone accessing a government vehicle in a restricted parking area." That explanation mattered. Sergio understood immediately that Zimmerman had not simply invented a reason to approach him. Then verify the vehicle assignment and my identification, Sergio said. Both will resolve it. Zimmerman asked him to remain where he was. By then, people near the convention center entrance had begun openly watching. Some recognized Sergio from the conference program. Others knew nothing about him except that a police officer had ordered him against a vehicle. A young attendee raised a phone and began recording from a respectful distance. Sergio noticed, but did not react. He did not want a crowd turning a manageable investigation into a confrontation. My credential is inside my jacket, he reminded Zimmerman. You may retrieve it if department procedure allows, or you can have me remove it under your direction. Zimmerman hesitated. You said you are with the Air Force? Yes. What do you do there? I already told you. I am a colonel. Zimmerman looked at Sergio's civilian clothing, then toward the conference entrance. You expect me to take that on your word? Sergio turned his head only slightly. No, I expect you to verify it. For the first time, Zimmerman had no immediate response. Then his radio sounded. Dispatch had begun checking the license plate, but before the result came back, a woman wearing a conference staff badge hurried down the steps. Yvette Warren, the event's 34-year-old logistics coordinator, had spent the morning directing speakers between meeting rooms. She had personally escorted Sergio to the emergency logistics session less than 2 hours earlier. Officer, Yvette called, stopping several yards away. I know that gentleman. Zimmerman lifted a hand, signaling her to remain back. Please stay there. His name is Colonel Sergio Thorpe. He is one of our scheduled panel leaders. Zimmerman glanced at her badge, but did not release Sergio. That was the first moment Sergio felt the situation shift from cautious verification towards something harder to explain. A witness had identified him, his credential was available, and the vehicle could be checked electronically. Still, the detention continued. Then dispatch came over Zimmerman's radio with the first objective answer. The sedan was registered to a federal fleet and assigned for official use connected with the conference. Several people close enough to hear exchanged looks. Sergio expected Zimmerman to ask for his credential next and finish the matter. Instead, Zimmerman asked dispatch whether the system showed the name of the individual authorized to drive the vehicle. Sergio slowly lifted his gaze from the roof. The original question had been whether he had legitimate access to the sedan. Now that the sedan's connection to the conference had been confirmed, Zimmerman appeared to be searching for another question. Officer, Sergio said, still composed. My identification is less than 12 inches from your answer. Zimmerman looked at the inside pocket of Sergio's blazer, then back at his face. We are going to do this my way. Yvette opened the conference roster on her tablet. I can verify him right now. Zimmerman did not look at the screen. Instead, he raised his radio again and spoke to dispatch. Sergio listened carefully. Zimmerman did not begin by giving his name. He began by requesting a deeper check on the sedan, and somewhere across the police radio network, another officer heard the exchange and started paying attention. The answer Zimmerman had requested arrived less than a minute later, and it removed another piece of uncertainty. Dispatch, after confirming with the conference transportation desk, reported that the sedan had been assigned to the Interagency Emergency Planning Group and that Colonel Sergio Thorpe was listed among the authorized users. Sergio listened without moving his hands from the roof. Yvette Warren remained nearby with the event roster open on her tablet, waiting for Zimmerman to look at information that could settle the remaining question in seconds. Officer, she said, Colonel Thorpe is listed here by name. I checked him in myself this morning. Zimmerman finally turned toward her. A conference list does not establish authorization to use a federal vehicle. Then check his credential, Yvette replied. Her tone was respectful, but the logic was becoming difficult to ignore. Zimmerman looked back at Sergio. Slowly remove the identification from your jacket with your right hand. Sergio followed the instruction precisely. He reached inside his blazer, removed a credential holder, and extended it without turning around. Zimmerman took it and examined the identification carefully. The name matched. The photograph matched. Sergio Thorpe's military affiliation and rank were clearly identified. For several seconds, Zimmerman said nothing. The people watching could not see what was printed on the credential, but they could see the change in his expression. Sergio lowered his right hand back to the roof. Is my identity now confirmed? He asked. Zimmerman did not answer immediately. Instead, he handed the credential back and asked, Why are you attending a military-related conference dressed like this? Sergio finally turned enough to look at him. Because this is not a military ceremony. It is a civilian interagency conference involving local agencies, emergency planners, aviation specialists, and military representatives. Yvette held up the tablet. That is correct. The issue should have ended there. The vehicle had been verified. Sergio's identity had been verified. A conference official had confirmed his role. Yet Zimmerman still did not tell him he was free to leave. That was when Sergio's concern changed. He was no longer wondering whether Zimmerman had a legitimate reason for the initial contact. He was wondering why verified information was failing to change the officer's judgment. What exactly remains unresolved? Sergio asked. Zimmerman's jaw tightened. I am making sure everything is legitimate. Which part is currently unverified? The question was calm, but it left very little room for ambiguity. Zimmerman glanced toward the growing group near the entrance. Several attendees were recording now, although no one interfered. Then Yvette stepped closer to the edge of the parking lane and turned her tablet so Zimmerman could read it. The conference roster displayed Sergio's full name, rank, organization, panel assignment, and scheduled speaking time. Zimmerman studied the screen. For the first time since the encounter began, he appeared to have no new factual question to ask. Then a second police vehicle entered the conference drive. Sergeant Dana Valencia had been monitoring radio traffic from several blocks away. She was 44, experienced, methodical, and known within the department for asking officers to explain not only what they had done, but what information justified each decision. As she approached the convention center, dispatch repeated the subject's name over the radio for documentation. Sergio Thorpe, the dispatcher said. Valencia's attention sharpened, but not because she recognized Sergio. She had heard something else in the exchange that concerned her. Zimmerman had continued the detention after both the vehicle connection and the man's identity appeared to have been independently confirmed. Valencia asked dispatch for the exact time the conference transportation desk had confirmed that Thorpe was an authorized user of the sedan. The dispatcher gave it. Then she asked when Zimmerman had confirmed Thorpe's credential. Another timestamp followed. Valencia glanced at the clock on her dashboard. Several minutes had passed since both answers were available. She turned into the parking area and saw Sergio still standing beside the sedan. Zimmerman noticed her vehicle and straightened. He expected routine supervisory support. What he did not know was that Valencia had spent part of the previous month reviewing another complaint carrying his name, and the timeline she had just heard over the radio sounded uncomfortably familiar. Sergeant Dana Valencia parked near the conference entrance and walked toward the sedan without rushing. She took in the scene before speaking. Sergio beside the vehicle, Zimmerman holding his position a few feet away, Yvette Warren with the conference roster still open, and a growing number of attendees watching from the sidewalk. Officer Zimmerman, bring me up to speed, Valencia said. Zimmerman explained the original security report and the concern about unauthorized access to a government vehicle. Valencia listened without interrupting. Then she turned to Sergio. Colonel Thorpe, I would like to hear your account as well. Sergio described the encounter in sequence, carefully separating what he knew from what he assumed. He acknowledged that Zimmerman had a legitimate reason to investigate the initial report. He explained that he had cooperated, identified himself, offered his credential, and remained in place while the vehicle assignment was checked. He did not accuse Zimmerman of racism. He did not speculate about intent. He simply described what happened after each fact became available. Valencia looked at Yvette. You personally verified Colonel Thorpe's participation? Yes. I checked him in this morning, and his name, rank, organization, and panel assignment are on our official roster. Valencia asked Sergio for permission to examine his credential. Sergio handed it to her. She compared the photograph and information, returned it, then contacted dispatch herself to confirm the vehicle assignment, Thorpe's authorized user status, and the relevant timestamps. Less than a minute later, she had the same answers Zimmerman had already received. Colonel Thorpe, Valencia said, you are no longer being detained. Thank you for cooperating. Sergio stepped away from the sedan and adjusted his blazer. The movement was ordinary, almost anticlimactic, but the atmosphere around them changed immediately. Zimmerman looked toward Valencia. Sergeant, I was still verifying access. The verification was complete, she replied. Her voice remained professional. We will discuss the rest privately. Zimmerman started to explain, but Valencia raised one hand. Not here. Sergio could have walked away then. Instead, he asked one question. Sergeant, will the duration of the detention after verification be documented? Valencia met his eyes. Yes. That answer mattered more to Sergio than an apology offered in front of strangers. He nodded and moved toward Yvette, who quietly told him his panel would begin in less than 20 minutes. As they started toward the building, Valencia asked Zimmerman to remain beside his patrol vehicle. Then she opened the mobile record system in her unit. She was not searching Sergio Thorpe. She entered Vincent Zimmerman's employee identification number. 2 prior complaint references appeared. The first involved a black high school teacher questioned near a municipal building. The second involved a black city engineer stopped while inspecting public infrastructure. Neither complaint had resulted in a finding serious enough to remove Zimmerman from patrol because the available evidence had been incomplete and key moments were disputed. But Valencia remembered the common issue. In both cases, the complainants said Zimmerman continued treating them as suspicious after their identities and lawful reasons for being there had been established. Now she had radio timestamps, body camera footage, conference security cameras, an independent event coordinator, and dozens of potential witnesses. The similarity did not prove motive, and Valencia knew better than to pretend it did. But it was enough to require closer review. Zimmerman watched her expression change. What is this about? He asked. Valencia closed the record screen. I need you to preserve your body camera recording and make no changes to your incident notes after the initial entry without documenting the amendment. Zimmerman stared at her. Are you saying I am under investigation? I am saying this encounter needs supervisory review. She contacted another patrol officer assigned nearby and arranged for coverage of Zimmerman's traffic post. Then she gave Zimmerman an instruction he had not expected to hear that morning. Give Officer Santiago the keys to the patrol unit. You are coming back to the precinct with me. Zimmerman looked toward the convention center doors where Sergio had disappeared inside. He seemed convinced the colonel had somehow triggered what was happening. He was wrong. Sergio had not made a single call. The person Valencia contacted next was Internal Affairs, and when she gave them Zimmerman's name, the investigator on the other end did not ask who he was. He already knew. Inside the convention center, Sergio had less than 15 minutes to move from being questioned beside a government sedan to leading a room full of emergency planners, aviation specialists, local officials, and military representatives. Yvette walked beside him through the lobby and asked whether he wanted the organizers to delay the panel. No, Sergio said. Everyone in that room has a schedule, and what happened outside does not change why I came here. Yvette studied him for a moment. You do not have to pretend it did not affect you. Sergio stopped near the conference room doors. I am not pretending. He looked through the glass at attendees taking their seats. I am deciding what gets my attention first. Minutes later, Sergio stood at the front of the room leading the emergency logistics panel, using leadership under pressure as one of his central themes, a subject that suddenly felt less theoretical than it had when he prepared his notes. He spoke about disaster response, incomplete information, and the danger of becoming emotionally attached to an early conclusion. Good decisions are not the decisions you refuse to change, Sergio told the audience. Good decisions change when better evidence arrives. Yvette, standing near the back wall, understood the significance immediately. Sergio never mentioned Zimmerman. He did not need to. Across town, Zimmerman sat in a precinct interview room while Valencia completed her preliminary supervisory report. He was increasingly convinced that Sergio had used his rank to escalate the encounter. Did Thorpe call somebody? Zimmerman asked when Valencia entered. Not that I am aware of. Then why am I sitting here? Because I reviewed the timeline. Zimmerman leaned back. I had a suspicious person report involving a government vehicle. And your initial contact is not the primary issue being reviewed. That answer unsettled him more than an accusation would have. Valencia placed a printed dispatch log on the table. The question is what happened after the basis for your suspicion began disappearing. Zimmerman looked down at the timestamps. Before he could respond, Valencia's phone rang. She stepped into the hallway. The Internal Affairs investigator had already requested preservation of Zimmerman's body camera recording, dispatch audio, and any available conference security footage. More importantly, he wanted Zimmerman returned from field duty pending an initial administrative review. Back at the conference, Sergio finished his panel to warm applause. When he stepped away from the podium, Yvette quietly told him the police department had asked whether he would provide a formal statement that afternoon. Sergio checked the time. "I will." "Are you filing a complaint?" she asked. Sergio considered the question carefully. "I have not decided what I am filing." Yvette looked surprised. "After what happened?" "That is exactly why I should decide based on what happened, not how angry I am about it." He gathered his notes. "I want the record to be accurate." About an hour later, Sergio arrived at the precinct and was shown to a separate interview room. Zimmerman briefly saw him through a narrow hallway window as an investigator escorted him past, but the two men were kept apart while their accounts were documented independently. Zimmerman watched Sergio disappear into the other room and wondered whether the colonel had come to demand punishment. He had no way of knowing that Sergio was approaching his own statement with the same caution he had shown in the parking lot, separating what he could prove from what he believed. A few minutes later, an internal affairs investigator entered Zimmerman's room carrying a thin folder. "Officer Zimmerman, before we discuss today, there is something you need to understand," he said. "Colonel Thorpe is not the first person to raise this kind of concern about your conduct." He placed the folder on the table. "Your name was already attached to two similar complaints." Zimmerman stared at the folder as the internal affairs investigator took the seat across from him. His name was Sean Sullivan, a 20-year department veteran whose calm manner made it difficult to guess what conclusions he had already reached. "What do you mean, my name was already in it?" Zimmerman asked. Sullivan opened the folder. "There have been two prior complaints involving contacts you handled. Neither produced sufficient evidence for a sustained finding on the central allegation, but both raised a similar procedural concern." Zimmerman frowned. "Those complaints were closed. The individual investigations were resolved based on the evidence available at the time," Sullivan corrected. "That does not mean prior documented incidents cease to exist. The first involved a high school teacher questioned near a municipal administration building after someone reported unusual activity around a restricted entrance. The teacher's identity and legitimate purpose had eventually been confirmed, but he later alleged that Zimmerman continued questioning him after that confirmation. The second involved a city engineer inspecting drainage infrastructure near a public works site. Again, the original contact had an articulable reason. Again, the disputed issue was what Zimmerman did after receiving information that should have reduced suspicion. Neither case had provided a complete, independent timeline. Today was different. Sullivan placed the dispatch log beside the folder. At 11:47, the conference transportation desk confirmed that the sedan was assigned to the interagency group and that Sergio Thorpe was listed among its authorized users. At 11:50, Thorpe's credential confirmed that the man standing beside the vehicle was Sergio Thorpe. Yvette Warren had also independently identified him through the official event roster. Zimmerman looked at the page. "I was making sure the authorization was legitimate." "That may be your explanation," Sullivan said. "Our job is to compare it with policy, recordings, witness statements, and the sequence of information available to you." Zimmerman's expression tightened. "So, because this man happens to be in Air Force, Colonel, suddenly everything becomes an internal affairs matter." Sullivan closed the folder halfway. "No, his rank is not why you are sitting here." The words landed harder than Zimmerman expected. If Sergio Thorpe had been an accountant, a mechanic, or unemployed, the same timeline would require review. For the first time, Zimmerman seemed to understand that the defense forming in his mind was aimed at the wrong issue. Meanwhile, in another room, Sergio gave his statement to a different investigator. He described Zimmerman's questions, his own responses, Yvette's intervention, and the sequence of verification. When asked whether he believed race influenced the encounter, Sergio did not avoid the question. "I believe it may have influenced how he interpreted me," he said. "But belief is not the same as evidence of his internal intent. What you can establish is what information he had and what he did after receiving it." The investigator paused before writing. That distinction would become important. By late afternoon, conference security had agreed to preserve exterior camera footage, dispatch had secured its audio, and Valencia had completed her supervisory account. Department command staff authorized Zimmerman's temporary administrative reassignment away from patrol while the formal review proceeded. It was not a final disciplinary judgment, and no one pretended otherwise. But his regular field assignment was over for the foreseeable future. Zimmerman received the notice shortly before 5 o'clock. He read it twice. What had begun that morning as a routine security call had now placed his conduct under a level of scrutiny the earlier complaints had never reached. Yet the most damaging evidence was not Sergio's rank, Yvette's testimony, or even the crowd of witnesses. It was Zimmerman's own body camera. Sullivan had begun reviewing the recording against the dispatch timestamps, and one moment stood out. After Zimmerman had seen Sergio's valid credential and heard Yvette confirm his conference role, the camera captured Zimmerman continuing to question why Sergio was dressed in civilian clothing. Sullivan replayed the sequence, then marked the timestamp. When he returned to Sergio's statement, however, he found something unexpected. One sentence in the investigator's draft described Zimmerman as having clearly intended to humiliate Sergio. Sergio read the line, picked up a pen, and drew a careful mark beside it. "This needs to change," he said. The investigator looked up. "You disagree?" Sergio nodded. "You can prove what he did. You cannot prove what he was thinking." The investigator looked from Sergio to the sentence he had marked. "You are saying you do not believe Officer Zimmerman meant to humiliate you?" Sergio shook his head. "That is not what I said. I am saying I cannot prove what he intended." He pointed to the draft. "I can tell you that I was humiliated. I can tell you that people watched me stand with my hands on a vehicle after I offered identification. I can tell you that my credential, the vehicle assignment, and the conference roster were all verified before the detention ended. Those are facts." The investigator leaned back. "And the racial component?" Sergio considered his answer. "I am a black man. Officer Zimmerman was given information that contradicted his first impression, and he continued searching for reasons to doubt me. I believe race may have affected that judgment. But if this process is supposed to determine what happened, then the report should not claim access to another person's thoughts." The investigator deleted the sentence and replaced it with language describing Sergio's experience and the documented sequence without assigning an unproven motive. Sergio read the revision and nodded. "That is accurate." Across the precinct, Zimmerman sat alone for several minutes after receiving notice of his reassignment. He had expected Sergio to demand the strongest possible punishment. Instead, Sullivan returned carrying an updated statement and said something Zimmerman did not expect. "Colonel Thorpe requested a correction." Zimmerman looked up. "What kind of correction?" "The draft attributed a specific intent to you. He said the evidence could not establish that." Zimmerman stared at Sullivan. "He defended me?" "No," Sullivan said. "Do not confuse accuracy with defense. His account of your conduct has not changed." That distinction unsettled Zimmerman. Anger would have been easier to dismiss. Precision was harder. Sullivan then reviewed the body camera sequence with him. Zimmerman heard his own questions again. He watched Sergio offer verification. He heard Yvette identify Sergio. He listened as dispatch confirmed the federal vehicle assignment. Then came the moment after the credential had been checked, when Zimmerman asked why a colonel was dressed in civilian clothing. On the recording, the question sounded different from how Zimmerman remembered it. It no longer sounded like verification. It sounded like resistance to information he had already received. "Pause it," Zimmerman said. Sullivan stopped the video. Zimmerman looked at the frozen timestamp. "How long after I checked his identification was that?" Sullivan gave him the interval. Zimmerman said nothing. For the first time that afternoon, he stopped explaining and began listening. In the other room, Sergio finished reviewing his statement. Before signing it, he added one final clarification. The initial security report had provided Zimmerman with a legitimate reason to make contact. The problem, Sergio wrote, was not that Zimmerman had asked questions. The problem was that his judgment did not appear to change when reliable answers arrived. When Valencia read the statement, she noticed that Sergio had preserved facts favorable to Zimmerman as carefully as facts critical of him. "You realize most people in your position would not make those distinctions," she said. Sergio signed the document. "Then most people would be making a mistake." Valencia looked at him. "After the way you were treated?" Sergio handed back the pen. "Fairness does not become optional when I am the person who was treated unfairly." By early evening, Sullivan had assembled the body camera recording, dispatch timeline, Yvette's statement, Valencia's report, and confirmation that the conference security supervisor was preparing exterior video for investigators. The evidence from that morning was becoming unusually complete. But before Sullivan could close the preliminary file for command review, his telephone rang. It was the conference security supervisor. He was not calling only about the footage. Two attendees had independently submitted recordings from different angles, and one of them had captured a moment Zimmerman's body camera had not clearly shown. Sullivan listened, wrote down the timestamp, and reopened the file. The review had just acquired another piece of evidence. Sullivan received the attendee recording through the conference security office shortly after 6 o'clock. It had been filmed from the convention center steps, far enough away to capture Zimmerman, Sergio, Yvette, and the sedan in the same frame. The video did not reveal a dramatic secret. What it revealed was more useful sequence. Yvette could be seen turning her tablet toward Zimmerman, while Sergio remained beside the vehicle. Zimmerman looked directly at the roster long enough to read it. Less than a minute later, he continued questioning Sergio instead of ending the detention. The second attendee recording began later but captured Valencia arriving and asking for the verification timeline. Together with the body camera footage and dispatch audio, the recordings narrowed the areas of uncertainty that had weakened the earlier complaints. Sullivan did not treat them as proof of racial intent. He treated them as evidence of conduct. That distinction remained essential. Across the precinct, Valencia met with a command supervisor to review Zimmerman's status. His temporary removal from patrol was already in effect, but the expanding record raised a larger question about whether the current incident should be considered alongside the two earlier complaints. The answer required formal review, not an instant verdict. Still, the department no longer had only competing memories. It had timestamps, recordings, witnesses, and a pattern worth examining. Zimmerman was called back into the interview room. Sullivan placed a written administrative notice in front of him. You will remain off patrol while this review proceeds. The matter is being referred for formal disciplinary evaluation under department policy. Zimmerman read the first page slowly. So this is it. This is not a final finding, Sullivan said. You will have the opportunity to respond, and the evidence will be reviewed through the established process. Zimmerman looked toward the darkening window. But I am not going back to my assignment tomorrow. No, for the first time, the consequences felt real to him. Yet Sullivan made one point unmistakably clear. This did not happen because Colonel Thorpe called someone important. He did not. Your status changed because today's evidence raised concerns that require review, especially when considered with your documented history. Zimmerman lowered the notice. The explanation left him with no powerful outsider to blame. By 7 o'clock, Sergio had returned to his hotel near the conference center. He removed his charcoal blazer, set his conference binder on the desk, and finally allowed himself to sit in silence. The day had demanded more restraint than he wanted to admit. His telephone rang. It was Valencia. She did not discuss confidential details of Zimmerman's personnel process, but she confirmed that Sergio's statement and the available recordings had been preserved and forwarded appropriately. I also wanted you to know, she said, your correction to the statement is staying in the record. It should, Sergio replied. Accuracy is the point. After the call, he looked through the window at the lights of Omaha. He did not feel triumphant. A career was not a scoreboard, and accountability was not revenge. What mattered was that the encounter would be examined on evidence rather than rank, anger, or public pressure. Weeks passed. Investigators reviewed the earlier cases, interviewed additional witnesses, and compared Zimmerman's decisions against policy. They also documented that both earlier complainants were black and reviewed a sample of Zimmerman's comparable contacts with non-black civilians to determine whether the same pattern appeared there. Sergio returned to his Air Force duties and assumed the matter would proceed without him. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived at his office. The return address was residential, not departmental. Inside was a handwritten letter from Zimmerman. Sergio expected an apology, an excuse, or perhaps an argument. Instead, the first sentence stopped him. You were right to correct their report. Sergio read it again. Zimmerman continued by saying he had watched the body camera recording more times than he could count. He had finally identified the moment he could no longer defend to himself, and it was not the moment he first approached Sergio. It was the moment after the evidence had already answered his questions. At the bottom of the page, Zimmerman had written one final line. I understand now that losing my assignment was not the worst thing that happened that day. Sergio turned the page over. There was one more paragraph. Sergio turned the page and continued reading. Zimmerman wrote that the formal review had forced him to examine more than one morning in a parking lot. Investigators had revisited the two earlier complaints, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed a sample of Zimmerman's comparable contacts with non-black civilians. In each of the three documented encounters involving black civilians, the initial contact had begun with a legitimate question, but Zimmerman prolonged the scrutiny after identity and lawful purpose were verified. In the comparable non-black contacts reviewed, Zimmerman generally ended or sharply narrowed the encounter once the same kind of verification was obtained. The review ultimately sustained multiple policy violations, including the unreasonable continuation of investigative contacts and a violation of the department's bias-free policing policy, based on the documented pattern across the reviewed encounters. Zimmerman was removed from patrol, and after the disciplinary process concluded, he resigned from the department rather than seek another sworn assignment. He did not ask Sergio to forgive him. He did not blame the conference attendees, internal affairs, Valencia, or the recordings. Instead, he wrote, "The hardest part was realizing you never needed your rank to prove I was wrong. I already had the information in front of me." Sergio folded the letter and placed it in his desk. He never replied, not because he rejected what Zimmerman had written, but because he believed some realizations belonged to the person who finally reached them. Several months later, Sergio returned to Omaha as a guest speaker at a leadership workshop that partnered with a regional career transition program for former first responders. Zimmerman had enrolled in that program weeks earlier. During a break, Sergio noticed him sitting near the back of the room in civilian clothes. Zimmerman looked different without the uniform, less imposing and more uncertain about where he belonged. He waited until the room had mostly cleared before approaching. "Colonel Thorpe." Sergio turned. "Mr. Zimmerman." Zimmerman nodded at the formality. "I did not know you were speaking today. I did not know you were attending." For a moment, neither man tried to make the encounter more comfortable than it was. Then Zimmerman said, "You could have made that report worse for me. Nobody would have blamed you." Sergio considered the statement. "Maybe not. Why did you correct it?" Sergio looked at him steadily. "Because the truth was already enough." Zimmerman lowered his eyes, then nodded. There was no dramatic handshake and no promise of friendship. Some wounds did not need to become relationships in order to produce change. "I am trying to figure out what comes next," Zimmerman said. Sergio glanced toward the workshop room. "Then figure it out honestly." Zimmerman gave a small nod and returned to his seat. Sergio walked toward his next session without looking back. He had never wanted Zimmerman destroyed. He had wanted the encounter examined without excuses, exaggeration, or special treatment. His rank had attracted attention once people learned it, but rank had not made him deserving of dignity. He had deserved that before anyone knew who he was. And Zimmerman's career had not changed because he happened to question an important man. It changed because evidence finally revealed a pattern that could no longer be explained away. Closing reflection. Sometimes racial bias is revealed not by an openly hateful remark, but by whose explanation we keep doubting after the same evidence would have satisfied us about someone else. There are moments when pride makes changing our minds feel like losing, even though refusing to. Change may cost far more. Sergio also leaves behind another quieter thought. Fairness can be most meaningful when we protect it even while we are hurt. He could have allowed anger to fill the gaps in the evidence, but he chose accuracy instead. Perhaps dignity is not measured only by how firmly we defend ourselves, but also by whether we can resist becoming careless with the truth when the truth is finally on our side. Zimmerman could not undo that morning, and Sergio did not erase its impact. Still, one man left with his integrity intact, while the other was finally forced to confront the difference between being certain and being right. If you had been in Sergio's position, how would you have balanced accountability with fairness, and what would you have done when you saw Zimmerman again months later?